Hey everybody, I have a confession to make. I love video games, and in particular, I love video game controllers. This is probably my favorite of all time, the Super Famicom controller, just the Japanese Super NES controller. But another joystick for the Super Famicom that was always very exciting to me is this one. This is a Japan-only Super Famicom joystick called the JB King. This fascination with joysticks and video game controllers led me down an interesting path at the time when the Mr. project happened. When we first getting into this, everybody was kind of making their own little consoles, little boxes for these. I made this wooden one. That was a lot of fun. Because I'm a major nerd, I wanted to be able to see the inside, so the top attaches with magnets. I can pop it off and look inside. Anyway, this works really well, but what this did was it got me very excited about, these FPGA gaming setups. So I wanted to make a sort of matching controller for it. I ended up making this, but really what this is just a little wooden box. And I put, I made it by gluing a bunch of different layers of different types of wood together. And then you get these really cool stripes. This is the oak top, and then poplar here, some more poplar. These are, I think these little triangle wedges are pine pieces here. But it really just got me started, and it made me think that it could be better. So where I went after that is to this joystick. So this is a much nicer one. You can see I do the stripes again. I'm using the natural color of this piece of poplar on the top. It just had a nice sort of difference in color here that looked kind of cool. And then I put my buttons in here, and I used 30 millimeter buttons here along with 24 millimeter buttons for kind of a cool effect. And then a joystick in the middle. And if you're wondering why I have buttons on both sides, that's just because I'm particularly fond of like old 80s kind of arcade games. Things like, Ms. Pac-Man, where the joystick is like the central point, and things like Donkey Kong or Galaga, they would have a joystick in the middle and buttons on both sides. So you could play it left-handed or right-handed. But this joystick, I added some additional buttons on the back that just hook up to different button inputs on this USB joystick adapter board. So this hooks into like a USB port to go into a Mac or Windows PC or into my Mr. box, or it even works on things like my Nintendo Switch. And the joystick is here with the ability to pull off the restrictor plate to change it between 4-way and 8-way operation. The reason I'm showing you all of this is because I have been building too many of these joysticks, and it is time to get rid of them. So what I have done is I have started a new website called uniquejoysticks.com. This is a website that shows off different photos of the joysticks that I've made, and also has a link to my Etsy store where you could go to buy them, or you could email me and just buy them directly. But I wanted to show those off because everything that I'm showing here is for sale. I also am particularly fond of older systems like the Commodore 64. And so this is another joystick that I made. This works currently, it's wired up for Commodore 64. And it's, again, using my little layers of wood glued together to make these stripes, which is pretty nice. But it has a nice long cord here, but you may be wondering about the two different buttons here, because, Commodore 64 fans know that the Commodore 64 only supports one fire button, really. Well, later in the life of that family of computers, they released something called the 64GS, or Commodore 64 game system. And that had a special controller that had two buttons on it. And that second button was wired in to use, one of the paddle inputs, like the inputs for these old spinny paddle controllers. So that they could have two buttons on there, more like an NES or a Master System. And so I've wired this button up to have that function. So this first one is the standard fire button, and this one is that secondary fire button from the 64GS. And actually a lot of Commodore 64 games, especially homebrews that have been made in recent years, do support that button. So it's quite cool to have that there. But now lots of other earlier Commodore 64 games, like Kung Fu in particular, would use the fire button to punch or to kick, and then you would push up on the joystick to jump. And then some of us, NES kids, found that a little bit awkward to run and then jump by pushing the joystick up. So what I've done is this is wired up so that the second button, its function is actually selectable. So if you look underneath the joystick, I have a little switch here. And this switch, when you push it this way, makes the second button function as that second fire button, like for the 64GS. I flip it the other way, and it functions as the up direction, just a mirror of the up direction on the joystick. This is a perfect joystick for the remake of Super Mario Brothers that came out for the Commodore 64 a few years ago. So this one is for sale as well. And actually, I have a video on YouTube of me making this joystick, and I'll link it here and also in the description. Here is another joystick that I've been working on. Mostly the reason for this one was that I had a bunch of cool pieces of different color wood, and I wanted to glue them together into stripes this way and see how it looked. And then I decided to, add sharp angles to it. This is like the Cybertruck of wooden joysticks. But it's actually really quite comfortable to hold and to put your hand on here. And then I just have, a simple 4 or 8-way selectable joystick here, and then 2 buttons. And now this one is not actually wired up to do anything yet, because I haven't really decided. I mean, maybe it's going to be an NES joystick, maybe Master System, maybe another Commodore joystick. One thought that I just had when I went to the Classic Game Fest. Oh, yeah, here we go. Classic Game Fest here in Austin, Texas, where I live. They had at one of the vendor booths lots of broken controllers. So I ended up buying a bunch of pieces there. For example, I just bought this NES controller board, so I can harvest this chip here and then be able to wire it up to function as an NES controller. Another option is that I bought this broken NES Advantage, which I pulled apart, and I figured out the board still is perfectly functional. It just has a bunch of buttons and switches on here that they got water on them, and they're all rusty or corroded at this point. So I probably can't really salvage it, to go back into this case to make it a functional NES Advantage. But I can take all the circuitry, including like the 2 controller cables that the NES Advantage had, which is selectable, and I can put the guts of this inside this. So then I would just add maybe on this top panel, the additional buttons and like the little dials to select the turbo rate and the switch between player 1 and player 2, and the slow motion button. I could put them up here or on the back maybe, I'm not sure. But this could be pretty awesome. So that's maybe a project that'll be happening. But if you wanted this would be for sale, and you could decide what system is this going to work for. There are other projects that I have going on that are kind of unrelated, but I mentioned this NES Advantage. I have sort of a shell here, and the joystick part works perfectly. So I'm thinking about maybe making this into a Commodore 64 Advantage of sorts with 2 buttons, and I would come up with the turbo fire circuit with a little like a 555 timer chip. And then, I don't know, maybe I could make these into other buttons to give different functions or something. This secondary button on a Commodore 64 could do lots of things. It could be that 64GS function. It could be the up on the joystick. It could also be the same function as the space bar, which is wired to the fire button on the other port, the other controller port. So if I made this joystick hook up with 2 cables to both control ports 1 and 2 on the Commodore 64, then I could add that button as well. Lots of different options. But that could be a cool thing. I would probably paint this kind of that beige color to make it match the Commodore 64 aesthetic. That could be a pretty fun project. Then some other projects that I have is like something like this, which is pretty ridiculous, but let me explain what this is. This is for a game that's sort of my current obsession. It's Baby Pac-Man. And it's a weird game that's sort of a combination hybrid of a Pac-Man video game with a maze, where you're chasing around ghosts, and then also a little pinball cabinet area. And it's really, really cool because you go back and forth between the 2 parts of the game. I don't have one of these machines, but through a bunch of tedious setup, you can use the game framework called Visual Pinball X, and some emulated pinball tables and the actual video game ROM, you can combine those together with PinMame, so you can actually play a fairly good emulated version of Baby Pac-Man, but it just doesn't feel great unless you have a good controller. So what I've created here is I have this controller that is very much, the aesthetic is very much inspired by the Baby Pac-Man cabinet. I drew all these graphics in Photoshop to kind of match the cabinet. You know, it's not exactly how the cabinet looks, but it's very close. And then I put this all together with this is wood. There's a metal plate that's bent around the front, which looks kind of like the control panel on a real Baby Pac-Man machine. And then of course I have pinball flipper buttons on each side. And this is the actual correct width of the Baby Pac-Man arcade pinball cabinet. And then the way that I've built it to work is that if I flip it over, it hooks in using a USB number pad, because Visual Pinball X has a little trouble reading from a standard joystick inputs. You have to use like joy to key utility or something to convert that over to keyboard presses. So I just bypassed that entirely by tearing apart a USB numpad and wiring directly onto the pins of the chip on there to hook up my joystick and buttons. And then I have this wired up so that these are also two different buttons on the top here that can be used for different functions. I have one of them set to coin input and one of them set to one player start. And then this is also kind of weird because I built it with this slot here so that it actually slides onto the edge of my desk and holds there very securely. A 1-inch desk. So this is a fun project. Oh, and this is an actual HAP branded reproduction Pac-Man cabinet joystick. It does have micro switches. It's not leaf switches like the real ones, but it does feel pretty good. The scale is exactly correct, and the feel of like the handle is exactly right. So anyway, this is an example of the kind of ridiculous thing that I can build, which brings me to my next point, which is just to say that I am open to hearing about custom project ideas that you might have. If there's some sort of joystick that you can imagine, but you think is a bit too tricky to build, and you can't figure out exactly how it could work, electronically, I may be able to help you with that. For example, I'm working on one right now for someone who's a huge fan of Robotron 2084. And I've always wanted to build a joystick with two actual joysticks on it. So I'm very happy to have this project to work on. This is not it. This is just my little prototyping jig that I made so that I can put in the joysticks and I can easily wire and test things as I'm trying to get all the things working. But I have, these two nice actual HAP joysticks here, which the customer he actually bought these and mailed them to me. So he knows exactly what he wants. And then also these buttons in the middle are to be used for functions on a PlayStation 1 or 2 controller. So he wants us to work on a PS1 or a PS2. And in order to do that, what I've had to do is deconstruct a PS1 gamepad and figure out how to wire everything together. And it's kind of an interesting project that I'm working on, so I could easily just hook up the left joystick to do the D-pad functions and the right joystick to do the same functions as the face buttons, like the triangle and circle and X and square buttons. But I also was going to try to make these joysticks also mimic the function of the analog joysticks on like a DualShock controller. The problem with that is those are, of course, analog joysticks and these are digital joysticks. Here's what I have so far, just to see kind of the way that this works out. I've taken the board of the controller here and had to solder on to the different pins where the directions are. And then also I've soldered into the section where there's a ribbon cable that ran off of the middle over to this little smaller board that holds the analog sticks. And then I've needed to build this little adapter board, especially for this, where I figured out the resistances are, it's roughly, I need like a 3.3K resistor, essentially, that is configured in different positions in order to replicate the functions of those analog sticks. So that's what I have here. And it's working pretty well. I'm trying to make this be a fairly you know, professional build and rugged, so nothing's going to go wrong with it. And the way that it works, I have these little header pins here so that the joystick can be plugged in from here. So it's easy to be taken apart. And so if a repair needs to be made, it will actually be possible to do that. So, I mean, I can show more about this if anybody's interested. But the point is I can do totally custom things if somebody wants something like that. And let's see, the last joystick that I will show off is probably my favorite one. I think is the prettiest one that I've done. This is another Commodore 64 joystick. This one is pretty cool because it has a bunch of different layers of different types of wood to get these fantastic stripes, including some maple on the top, very curly maple, so it has these nice waves. And then this dark red is a African paduak, I think that's how you pronounce it, wood. It looks really, really awesome. The video doesn't do it justice. And then the buttons and the joystick in here are actually illuminated, so they light up white, including the ball on the joystick here. So it's kind of fun. And then, keeping with that light up theme, I actually, with the wood, I also glued in a layer of plexiglass, which is lit from the inside by white LEDs that match the color of these buttons and joysticks. So it lights up kind of like a Tron stripe on here. And this is a really nice rounded ergonomic shape. So it feels really, really nice to play. Again, the symmetrical thing, because, you know, that's what I do with for my old games that I like. And then underneath, you know, it's completely reconfigurable. You can switch your gate to change your direction of your joystick, but then all these different pins can be plugged in to reconfigure what the different buttons do. And I've just labeled these here. If somebody buys this, I would give instructions on how to do that. Or maybe I could even wire in some switches, I'm not sure. But another feature of these joysticks that I make is, you can't see it, but I put inside the layers of the wood, I put big pieces of steel, big pieces of heavy metal, so that these weigh much more than they would if they were just made of wood alone. Because obviously you want them to stay very stable while you're playing. And, you know, with nice, you know, rubber feet on the bottom, and with that extra added weight of the steel, they hold they're very stable, very easy to play with. So that's it. These are all the different things that I have for sale at uniquejoysticks.com. You can check those out. If you have any questions, just send me email or, you know, comment on this video, and maybe, you know, you can end up with one of these joysticks, or we can work together to make something really special. So thanks for watching.